Greetings and salutations. You are listening to the Into the North podcast, where we take a look at the competitive side of the Commander format, also known as CEDH. I'm one of your hosts, Lyndon, aka Noobzors, and today I'm joined by my co-hosts, Matt, aka Null.
Yo, yo.
Reed, aka Sick Robot.
How you doing?
And very special guest, Phil Gallagher, aka Thraben U.
Hello, folks. Nice to be here.
And in this episode, given we have a expert on Legacy joining us, we are going to be covering what lessons can we as CDH players learn from Legacy players who are, dipping their toes into CDH and bringing their, unique and interesting perspectives to the format. So, before we get into that, have you guys been up to anything interesting since our last episode that you want to share? I can say myself, I participated in the Playmax 3 event, put on PlayDH, that tournament this past weekend. I took Thrasios Tago Yeet Control, and I made it to top 16, but unfortunately did not make it to the finals. And this is something, maybe we can talk about a bit with Phil as well. Kind of a unique aspect of CDH is partially why, we didn't make it. So it was against, in my pod, we've had Joking 101 on the show before. I was going against him. I had another friend of the show, Jeffrey, in my pod as well. But so Joking is, he's playing Timna Rog, kind of Adnos stuff. He's going off on his turn. And one of my other opponents had an active DRS. So we were kind of like, worrying about Dockside, blah, blah, blah. And we actually missed not just the player who had the DRS, but kind of collectively as a table missed a good opportunity to actually stop the combo with the DRS. And I think that's kind of interesting that in CDH, obviously, if you're trying to maximize your own win percentage, you're not just responsible for your own pieces in play. You want to make sure that your opponents that are, I guess temporarily your buddies or teammates when someone else is comboing off, don't miss their key pieces on board as well. But yeah, that's it for me.
Yeah,
actually,
and another lesson there. One other thing that is also at the end of the table is a person, and politics are also a great way of playing to your outs.
Yeah. I also had a very busy day that Saturday at Playmax. I actually commentated the first round, which was pretty cool, because I had watched the first Playmax as well, so it was sort of interesting to see. Sort of the difference, especially in a meta composition, was interesting. And then later that day, I went on to play 2 matches of my MLC league. And I actually picked up a win in one of those, which I'm pretty sure actually locks me for at least semifinals. I'm actually, I think, first in standings over the entire MLC right now, which is pretty neat.
Hell yeah, Reed, dude, doing the podcast proud.
Oh yeah. So I have 2 more matches next week. Unfortunately, that is home division matches, so Morgan Spleenface will be in those pods. As well as Ian, previous winner of the MLC, as well as Squirrel Mob, also not a shabby player himself. Those ones are going to be pretty significantly harder to win IMO, but we'll still try our best, I think. Gotta buff up that scoreline a bit, huh? I need the bye to the finals.
Yeah, I don't know who to root for, you or Morgan.
You just root against us both.
Yeah.
Easy
Honestly,
call. Matt, anything for you?
Not really.
And Phil, I know you've had a particularly busy July so far. Doing all kinds of CDH stuff, eh?
Doing all sorts of kinds of stuff. I have 8 guest appearances across various formats and streams and audio mediums over the next week or so. So I am keeping very busy. It's very fun, but working as a full-time content creator over the summer means that sometimes you don't actually have as much free time as you might think you would.
I mean, what would you do in your free time anyway? Play Magic, right? So,
I don't know the last time I've played Magic with my free time. My free time now becomes Dungeons and Dragons instead, which is also awesome. But that would be a different podcast.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay, cool. So without further ado, let's jump into housekeeping. And as always, in housekeeping, we like to give a shout out to our new patrons. This week we have a new patron, Willow L, that we'd like to give a shout out to. So, big shout out to you again, Willow L. Thanks for your support. As we say in the end of the episode, as always, your support helps support. Your support helps support. Your support helps us, improve the quality of the podcast, and maybe do some exciting things that. And expanding our content that could be on the horizon. Who knows? Anyway, moving on to new developments. Reed, I'll give this one to you.
Sure. So new developments this week is, as always, doing some shilling / advertising for Tier 1 Con. Of course, not just shilling and advertising, because we actually do love Tier 1 Con. Event last year was fantastic. Event coming up this year is shaping up to be pretty freaking good. There are, I think, a ton of content creators are making it out this time, so I believe there are still tickets available. It's going to be tight, but if you haven't yet signed up and you can afford to make it out, it's out in Copenhagen, which is going to be pretty awesome. You definitely should. Again, myself and Morgan are going to be over there. I'll definitely be competing. We'll see about Morgan. I think Morgan's 50-50 in terms of either doing commentary or competing, so we'll see how that one shakes out. But yeah, if you can make it out, definitely should. It's going to be a good time, I think.
Yeah.
Every time we bring it up, I feel a sadness in my heart that I'm unable to make it this year.
Yeah.
If that should serve as recommendation enough for our listeners to try and make it this event. It was so much fun last year. I cannot stress into this enough.
Yeah.
Definitely going to be trying to make it back next year. Cool. Well, that's enough of all this preamble. Let's get into the main topic, which is going to be lessons from Legacy with Thraben U. See, it's we got that nice little alliteration in there, and little lessons play on you, Thraben U. It's great. Okay, I'm patting myself on the back big time for this title.
Yeah, that episode took hours. To workshop that one title.
It did well in trials. We threw that out there to the public and got some surveys, and we had to spend big money to kind of run this through testing groups. But
this is focus groups.
Yeah,
A/B testing.
Yeah. This was the title that seemed to work the best.
Yeah, ABU testing. Yeah.
Man, they just kept leaning into this joke instead of just cutting it and let it go, folks. It's gonna be an episode. Here we go.
It's a trademark. We lean into everything way too hard.
Okay, cool. So I'll kick things off. Mr. Phil Gallagher, Thraben U. Who are you? What are you known for? And what do you do in the MTG space?
Well, you've covered my name, so I'll let that one go. But as far as who I am a variety Magic the Gathering content creator who posts daily YouTube content under the handle Thraben U on YouTube. I tend to emphasize interesting decks, cool interactions, rather than necessarily the most meta decks. But the approach that I take is very educational, and I am a very competitive player, all sorts of IQ top 8s, won legacy challenges, that sort of stuff. So I take bad and questionable decks and try to pilot them as optimally as I can, and try to keep it both educational and entertaining.
He is also the co-host of a really, really good legacy podcast, the Eternal Glory podcast. I just wanted to shout that out because I am a avid listener. And if any of our listeners are interested in, legacy content or even just variety of content, you play all kinds of different formats. Yeah, definitely check out Phil's YouTube channel and check out the Eternal Glory podcast as well.
I will also confirm. The content is top notch. It doesn't really matter if you play the formats or not. You just go check it out anyway, because it's very entertaining. There's a lot to take away from basically any video there. And it's also great to just have on in the background, because Phil has possibly one of the most soothing voices in MTG content creation.
Oh yeah, I'm bedtime noises for a lot of people.
Magic gameplay ASMR. Let's go.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was actually kind of funny. I think a YouTube comment on one of our episodes, someone said, like, I don't even play CDH, but I like listening to your guys' podcast. I was like, what? Why would you do that? And then me over here listening to the Eternal Glory podcast on the rig, and there's not even touching Legacy at all. So yeah, now I get it a bit more now. But yeah, so as a bit of a follow-up to that, can you give us a brief summary of your MTG history?
Yeah, so I've been playing since Scars of Mirrodin. Well, actually, slightly before its release, but that was kind of my first release that I was around for. And I basically jumped into Legacy after I had been playing Magic for just a few months. Like, I had been playing, I don't know, maybe 6 months or something like that before I just started getting into Legacy. So I kind of immediately went from kitchen table to, like, oldest and, like, arguably most intricate Magic format. Like, Vintage has a similar, just insane number of card interactions and huge card pool. And I kind of did floor trading, just kind of like going to events and trading and grinding value for about a year before I actually had accrued a good enough Legacy collection to start playing in events. I very quickly became known for the Legacy deck called Death and Taxes, which is a mono-white control deck where your controlling elements are stapled to hate bears. So the things that you refer to as hate bears and stacks in EDH, that's my jam in Legacy.
Nice. Yeah, and I mean, we for listeners, we played a couple games of CDH with Phil just before recording, and he busted out, I guess, true to form, a mono white Heliod. Yeah.
Probably the truest to form that you could be in terms of deck selection.
With the Thalia playmat, of course.
Oh yeah,
Thalia
100%.
playmat, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but I played in a whole lot of competitive tournaments. I made a website for Death and Taxes, which was thrabenuniversity.com. Surprise, surprise, given my current username. And I've been involved in a lot of major Legacy projects like the Legacy Premier League, and I'm one of the biggest Legacy content creators these days.
Dude, that's awesome. So here, I'll throw the interview cap over to Matt, and then and then Reed as well. So
yeah,
take it away.
Sure. Well, we are a CDH podcast, and I guess we're just kind of curious, like, how did you get to CDH? What is your journey here?
So I played a little bit of regular EDH about 10 years ago, and then this summer, I went full-time content creator over the summer. Normally, I'm a Latin teacher during the year, and I normally work a summer job, but things are going well enough with the content that I said, I'm not going to do that this year. I'm going to focus full-time on content creation. And because I had that time, I decided I was going to try to get in touch with other parts of the Magic community that I hadn't really interacted with. You know, a lot of people play Magic in different ways, and Commander/EDH is one of those largest ways, and I would be a fool not to try to understand and get to know some of those people, right? Especially if I have any aspirations at doing Magic stuff professionally at all. So I built a Zonksha EDH deck and a Marwyn CEDH deck as my starting points, and I'm starting to expand from there.
Wow, yeah, those are kind of solid starter choices. Sanchez. It was tons of fun.
Well, I don't actually know that Marwyn is a good first CEDH deck. We can talk about that or not.
No, Marwyn will teach you a lot of great lessons, like the kinds of interaction pieces that you'll see from your opponents, and the speed of the format and anything. So I don't know. I think it's good.
Yeah.
I guess let me explain why I chose that.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that would be
please.
a great insight, actually.
So, as a competitive player, one of my general rules of thumb is that if I don't understand a format, the first thing that I do is play an incredibly linear deck that does not care about what my opponent is doing, so that I can start learning the cards in the format.
That is so awesome. That's literally advice that we've said on this podcast many times. That it used to be that like a good people would recommend stuff like Yisan to new players because it was cheap. But Yisan is, not like it's got so many different branching paths you can go down because of, just being a tutor in the command zone. Then also it's, it's like reactive. So you have to know what your opponents are doing, and sometimes you have to preempt what they're about to do by getting the exact right piece. So we've said that that's a terrible suggestion for new players. But new players, I've said in the past, I'm like Godo, where it's a very straightforward kind of linear plan. So then you don't have to use a lot of your brain power figuring out what you have to do, and then you can kind of just sit and observe and watch what your opponents are doing. So that the fact that that's your approach is actually just super awesome.
Yeah, so I spent a few hours goldfishing the deck. I had played plenty of Legacy Elves, so a lot of the lines were kind of similar to stuff that I was used to doing. The deck goldfishes pretty well.
That's a trade with a lot of CDH, like just
linear combo decks tend to goldfish pretty well. Consistent.
The issue
turn 2,
is
turn 3 wins.
that as soon as your opponent's interaction starts getting involved, you just have like so many fail points in the deck, and your deck is asking for a lot of things to go right in order for you to combo off. Because you not only need Marwyn, you also need usually either 2 or usually 3 counters on Marwyn, plus at least 2 other combo pieces beyond that. Usually it's 2 pieces that give you infinite mana, and then 1 other piece that has to be your outlet. So when you actually start looking at the number of things that have to go right and the number of specific cards that you have to have in order to consistently go off, I just don't think you're anywhere in the consistency ballpark of some of the other proactive decks. So while it was a great thing to play for my first like dozen CEDH games, I just don't think the deck is tournament viable. Like I don't think the deck is like an S tier deck. And if this is a competitive format, I don't think you should be playing anything other than some of the absolute best decks, unless you have a very, very, very good reason to. Like, oh, in my meta where Thassa's Oracle isn't around, this deck has huge like local level implications for me, and it's going to be really strong here. But if Marwyn is not going to win me tournaments, if I ever decide to play in one, I shouldn't spend a lot of time working with it. I should move on to trying to learn something else.
Fair enough.
That's definitely actually sort of it's sort of I would say closely linked to one of the recommendations that I have for new players a lot of the time as well, which I'm pretty sure we've gone over this a bit on the podcast, but I'll just touch back on it again, which is I think it's really important for new players to so to get a general idea of what's in the format, it's a really good idea to play just again like low color linear combo decks with not a lot of dissonancies, but also on the other side, I think it's really important as well, once people have sort of learned with those decks, is to then go to probably the highest end of the format, so 4 and 5 color staple piles, and play some of those decks as well, just so you have context for pretty much both sides of the format in terms of, so here's what just like a proactive game plan looks like, so that you can actually go pay attention to your opponents, and then here's what the actual like top of the format looks like, so that you have like power level context for like how other decks that you're playing should stack up to like what is actually at the top of the format right now.
Yeah, I actually talked about that recently with one of my podcast co-hosts, Brian Koval. He calls this finding true north. Like, learn the basics of the format with some deck, and then play the best deck for a little while, even if you don't intend on always like playing that deck, just so you understand the play patterns and cards that are in the best deck. Because a lot of times by piloting a deck, you learn things that are not obvious from the other side of the table.
And it's actually even I would say that's even productive for experienced players in the format, especially if in CDH or in other formats, if you do a lot of brewing and playing with weird, wonderful decks like Phil does on his channel all the time. If you're the type of player that plays a lot of just like homebrews or stuff that's sort of in like levels of the format that like you're not consistently seeing like top 8s from those decks or whatever in tournaments, or even like day 2s a lot of the time, I think it's actually pretty important a lot of the time, like maybe every like 6 months or so, depending, just to like play a couple of matches with like what you think the best deck is, just so you sort of like reorient yourself and then have context again, to just keep brewing.
Yeah, playing against the best deck also just like checks your own ego, because sometimes you think you have this really good idea and then you play against the best deck for a while and you go like, oh, okay, like I was getting cute. I gotta rein it in a little bit.
Every deck in every competitive deck, every brew has a great plan until they get Thoughtseize Force of Will.
Thoughtseize.
Yeah.
Well, I guess talking about the best deck, like just entering the format now, what do you think is the best deck? What stands out?
I don't know for sure. So like the thing about playing CEDH is you are being put into pods with humans who have human opinions and their own personal preferences, and a lot of times you are playing against something that in some way is a representation of the person you're playing against, even if it is kind of competitive. So like I have not played against like I would say like the full range of tier 1 deck list yet. My general feeling is that deck lists that have blue and Tymna are good.
That is a
Can
great
confirm.
call.
Yeah. If you could learn anything, that's a good lesson.
I
That's a good
think
takeaway.
that's probably the fastest that I've seen somebody come to the conclusion, which I would say is probably the correct conclusion. I'm sure the rest of the podcast has similar opinions. Maybe
There's no
diverging
way.
in some
I mean,
ways
we
that-
didn't definitely do
that-
like an episode called the Thrasios Tymna problem
Yeah,
years ago.
Just that might be the fastest I've seen somebody pick up on the fact that Tymna is possibly the best commander in the format.
Yeah.
Well,
And
you're
I'm also,
talking to someone who played against Luris Legacy for a long time.
Yeah.
So like I just feel that comparison right
Yeah.
there. Just like card advantage that is sitting in your command zone, coupled with a combo piece or other enabler in the command zone. Like it's just like very obvious to me, right? And the decks
Yep.
that have 2 cards sitting in the command zone, like have a 98 card like other main decks, so that like also very 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 slightly reduces your variance and just gives you that +1 extra card. In constructed formats, it's like having the Yorion versus not having the Yorion, right? It's just a
Yep.
little advantage over other decks.
And instead of having a downside, the upside is that you just get to play 4 colors instead of like 3 or whatever you'd be playing usually.
Imagine the world where you get to play Luris plus something else in the companion zone, and it's actually not even a downside. Actually, they work better together. Like that's it's outrageous. Partner is maybe one of the. I mean, it's contentious, but I think people will often say that it's one of the biggest mistakes in EDH.
Yeah,
design-wise.
I very much believe that Companion is probably the worst designed 60 card mechanic. Like, unnerfed Luris broke Vintage. Like, they had to ban a card in
that's insane.
Vintage, folks.
Yeah.
There's literally no
Yeah.
other banned cards in Vintage other than things like Anti and Manual Dexterity.
Dude, imagine a card so good that even when they increase its cost by 3, it's still ban worthy. Like that's outrageous.
It's just like even they nerfed 2 things by 3, and then they still have to ban Luris in Legacy, and then they still have to ban Zerta in Legacy, and now Yorion is potentially on the table to also
Yeah.
be bannable.
Dude, what do you mean they increase its cost by 3? Now you can just vial it in and it's uncounterable.
True. Yeah.
But actually, speaking of getting into the format, I'd actually I mean, obviously the podcast is very interested in this. I have a special interest in this, because I try to do a lot of work to help new players get into the format. So I'm really interested in like what the hurdles that you encountered, like sort of trying to get into CDH a bit more, like you sort of came across, and then sort of like anything that you think might have helped from your background in terms of getting into the format.
So, everything wasn't really in one place. Like that was kind of my first issue. Is I like went around and I said like, where do I go to learn about this format? And I got like so many wonderful messages from members of the CEDH community who were like very willing to send me stuff. My first question was like, why hasn't anyone compiled this in one place? And so I just like made a page on my webpage where it's like, okay, here's all the CEDH resources that people sent me. Just like, here's the podcast, here's the written stuff, here's the introductory videos, here's your gameplay channels, here's your how to play webcam games stuff. Like my first hurdle was like I was expecting to be able to read about everything in one place, and that didn't really exist. I think some people are currently working on changing that. I think there's a budding is it CEDH guide?
It's ch.guide as a website, and it is a fantastic resource. If you're getting into the format for the first time, anybody that's listening to this, definitely go check out cdh.guide. I think this is basically exactly what you're talking about in terms of just getting everything in the same place.
Yeah, so that aggregation was kind of the first thing that I kind of had to jump over. As far as other hurdles, I was pretty good via spell table so long as I could actually click on the cards and read them, but like I definitely had to have like Scryfall up on my phone as well for like the ones that were like too blurry to be captured. I will say that as a like legacy and vintage player, I probably know 85% of the cards that are being played in CEDH just at a glance, minus like some of the random lands, but like those are kind of whatever. Whereas when I play like regular EDH, it's just like I have no idea what 90% of the permanents that are in play are right now. So it's accessible if you have followed competitive formats.
Well, there's kind of a joke, Commander is Magic's kind of, I don't even know if you call it flagship, but it's certainly the biggest format in Magic. And many new players come through EDH, and it's always baffling to me. I mean, I came through EDH largely as well, but you're coming to a format where there's 4 players with 100 card singleton decks who have access to the entire history of every single card in or just about every single card ever printed in Magic. 20,000 plus cards. And because of the way that Commander is, especially if it's in casual, the amount of viable cards that you could see in a deck are like almost endless. It is a crazy crazy kind of ask to get a new player to, and just kind of like it's very sink or swim. So I mean, at least you CDH is a bit smaller of a card pool, and as you said, you're familiar with a lot of them from your legacy and vintage experience. But I did always just find that funny, the new players joining EDH, and like the fact that they even keep playing Magic after that is honestly a miracle. Yeah,
I have a great anecdote here. So last night I was doing a charity stream, and I was playing my Zongxia EDH deck, and someone else in the pod owned a Zongxia EDH deck as well. And I played a Bedlam, which makes it so that no creatures can block. And she was like, oh my gosh, I need that card. I've never seen this card before. Despite the fact that it's like an absolute perfect fit for her commander deck, right?
Yeah.
Like the card pool is massive in casual EDH, and it's relatively small in competitive EDH. So for example, if you take any given, say, monocolored deck, you're probably going to share, I don't know, 30 to 50 cards with that other monocolored deck, just because the core of, say, the Hate Bears or the Green Ramp is just going to be so shared between those decks.
Yeah. So I think Reed also asked you this a bit. But yeah, so when starting CDH, what in your opinion was made easier by coming from a legacy background?
I guess aside from just like
the cards, like anything play pattern wise, or I mean, because they are quite different. I mean, there's some similarities certainly, but it is quite a leap to go from 1v1 60 card to 4-player free for all.
Like this isn't necessarily from being a legacy player, but from being a competitive tournament Magic player. Like, I know how to watch my triggers. I know priority. I know sequencing. I know like how to be thinking about like what my opponents are doing and what I need to play around. So even when I'm missing pieces of the information, I can put things together pretty quickly. And there have been very few times where I'm like, okay, how does this interaction work? Like I have the rules knowledge I need. I have the experience I need working with competitive formats. And I guess this also meant that like I just conceptually understood the like play to win attitude of this format that might be a little like bristly or off-putting to someone who is coming from casual Commander. You know, there's not the rule zero talk of like, and what are you comfortable with? Are you okay with infinite turns? It's like, no, I am here to kill you, hopefully fast. You know, CEDH is often described as this like turn 2 or turn 3 format, but in reality, it's probably like a turn 5 or turn 6 format because people just get stopped and there's interaction.
Yeah. It's sort of a turn 3 format in the same way that Modern was supposed to be a turn 4 format in terms of like most games don't end on turn 4, but they're like the fastest decks in the format are like ending the game on turn 4.
And you just need to be doing something impactful or be prepared to answer something impactful from your opponents by turn 3.
Certainly these days, CDH games are definitely going up to like turn 6 pretty consistently.
Yeah. I would almost say that I play longer games in CEDH than I do in like casual EDH.
Which is incredible.
Yeah, I mean, actually, here, Phil, question for you. What's the longest game of Magic in any format you've ever played? Usually an EDH because, 4 players and games can get, into weird kind of stabilized equilibriums. But yeah, what's the longest game you've ever played?
In terms of time or turn count?
Time.
Well, the issue is that competitive games on Magic Online or in paper have a round clock. So, like, there is a hard cap there. I have absolutely, like, manually milled someone out just by, like, forcing them to draw their entire library by taking, 53 turns or whatever. I've done that in Constructed before. But I would imagine games of casual Commander where everyone can kill each other's stuff but no one can win, they can go on for literal hours.
So, my previous record for longest game was a mono blue CDH pod, which, speaking of people being unable to like close games, like, when people are playing, when I was playing Baral with just a 1/3 and then like Azami's out there 0/2 or whatever. So that
and
my
none
previous
of them have good win cons, even aside from combat. Like, they're just all terrible.
My previous record was 4.5 hours, which I recently smashed with a 6-hour game. That was a marathon. So yeah, games of CDH, especially, it certainly depends on pod composition, but it don't get confused. Games of CDH can certainly go very, very, very long. Cool.
I guess where we just keep going here. So I actually like this question a lot, and I do really want to know the answer to it too. Which is just what surprised you to find that CDH has but Legacy doesn't, or even potentially vice versa?
But yeah, vice versa as well.
Okay. CEDH has free interaction spells that are not legal in Legacy.
Yeah.
So there have been a couple of times where I've been comboing off and I'm like, okay, people are tapped out. I don't need to play around Force of Will. And then I'll get what's the free black kill spell? If you can
Deadly Rollick.
Yeah. And then I'll just like get hit by a Deadly Rollick while I'm trying to combo off. So like I expected to know what all of the free interaction was because like it's just so played in Legacy and Vintage. All your Force of Wills, Force of Negation, Snuff Outs, that sort of stuff.
Even Pacts.
Yeah. Like, I expected to know all of those, and then I keep getting hit by these Commander control free cards.
I will tell you, they're just as shocking to us every time. I mean, you learn to expect them. It doesn't mean that you're any happier when you see them out of the other side of the table when there's like just zero telegraphing. You're just like, well, hope they don't have the SWAT here.
Yeah, all of your opponents could be tapped out. Oh, I'm sorry. I was gonna say all of your opponents could be tapped out, and you're like, well, I guess I don't have to worry about this, but I've still got to worry about Fear, SWAT, Force, Misdirection, Pact, Mindbreak Trap, like
misstep sometimes.
Misstep. Yeah, it goes on, man.
I guess the other thing that's really surprising to me is how much variance there can be based on pod composition. So I'll do 2 specific games here. I recently played a game with Brian Koval, one of my podcast co-hosts, where he controlled an Archivist of Ogma, and he probably drew like maybe literally 20 cards off that card over the course of a game. And I played one in a game that we played right before we started recording this, and I think it lived 3 turn cycles, and I drew 0 cards off of it.
Yeah.
So just like the cards that your opponents can play will impact how good some of your cards are, especially if you have these situational cards like say what is it, gnome Terramancer, deep gnome Terramancer,
yeah, deep gnome Terramancer,
Archivist of Ogma, or even like the Rhystic Study, Mystic Remora sorts of things.
Yeah, even
like
like
Runic Armasaur is another good one too. That one, I've been in pods where Runic Armasaur draws like 20
absolutely
and then
nothing. Or I feel like
the Dino has never been good. I stand by this. The Dino has always been bad.
No,
I've seen it go absolutely ham.
Dino was great in Flash times.
It was fine in Flash times. I would take many value. Anyway, tangent over. I'll pass back. But yeah, just like, yeah, I know what you mean that like there's just like, yeah, there's just a ton of variance in terms of not just pod composition, but also a lot of decks just because you're in 100 card singleton, like you can play a lot of really great cards and you can have a pretty consistent game plan. But it's sort of interesting in terms of just a lot of the time the way that game plan gets executed, like sometimes runs into certain pieces and sometimes doesn't. Like even like for example when you're playing Marwyn, even if you like are playing against an Archivist of Ogma, say on the board, there are a lot of hands that like don't feed it at all. There are a lot of hands that feed it with like every card in your hand. You have like 3 fetch lands, you have 2 creature tutors, you have like another like land tutor on deck or something in your hand. So it's just, yeah, there's just I think maybe just variance in general.
Yeah, even with my Heliod deck that I was just playing, like the first game that I played out, I just like slammed a turn 1 Sarah's Ascendant and just like had this giant lifelinking creature, and I was going to pressure your life totals immediately and then back it up with some hate pieces. And then the second game I played, it was like, well, I have Walking Ballista in the opener, so I'm gonna get to about 6 mana and just attempt to go for it. And I went for it with protection. It didn't work.
Cool. So coming from Legacy, what similarities / differences have you noticed between the approach that Legacy players and CDH players take to their respective formats? So this can be like card evaluation, differences, deck selection, play patterns, card pool, that sort of stuff.
I feel like a lot of the CEDH players and a lot of the deck lists that I've looked at accept having highly situational cards with high upside, whereas in Legacy, a lot of times you're just trying to play the best low variance cards that you can. Like Legacy is full of like these brainstorms, ponders, preordains, all these things that are just trying to get your deck to do very close to the same thing, and you don't have very many singletons. And obviously in CEDH you can't have any singletons, but a lot of the decks that I've looked at have cards for niche situations. So for example, the Marwyn deck is playing Endurance to combat Thassa's Oracle, even though it's not like particularly great at getting the Endurance when it wants to have the Endurance.
Right.
And I found a lot of CEDH decks are willing to take these incredibly high ceiling, incredibly low floor cards rather than play cards that are more consistent.
I definitely agree in general. I do think that Endurance has like more uses beyond just stopping the Thoracle, but maybe that's the primary reason why people put it in. But like, a big part of this format is just top tutors, and like that'll shut off a top tutor.
No, it won't.
It doesn't actually shut. It's bottom, but it does. It bottoms them instead of.
But it does hit things
like
Breach.
Yeah, it hits stuff like Breach. Hits
Reanimator.
Stuff like value decks. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's like. Let me
also
use
a good
more
card for
narrow
loops
example
as well.
to like really show this.
Yeah.
What's the colorless producing land? Is it Emergence Zone that lets you play stuff with Flash?
Yep, that's the one.
So like I looked at the Marwyn mana base and I'm like, hey folks, you aren't playing enough green pips in your mana producing
Yep.
lands. Like
Yeah.
this is beyond greedy. Like you need to cut some of these. And I
Yeah.
got a lot of flack for saying that. And then I like busted out the hypogeometric calculator and I was like, hey, literally a third of these don't produce turn 1 green mana. Like
Yep.
this is a problem. And so I started cutting colorless lands from my mana base. But people would immediately come back with, yeah, but you can go off in response to a Thassa's Oracle. It's like, no, if I could have tried to go off, I already would have tried doing it because I am a proactive deck. And I just didn't like some of these niche cards. Like Mouth of Ronan is another one where it's like, yeah, that's really cool for your crop rotation package, but like, is it worth having that over just a forest or another green producing land? And I don't know that it is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I ran into that problem when I revisited Yisan recently. I was like, oh, okay, I was just mulliganing all the time because I'm like, you don't need that many lands to have a good Yisan opener, right? You just, like a piece of ramp and, a forest and something else. That's all you need. But I was like, man, I'm finding these hands that have, a ramp piece, but then my lands are just 2 colorless lands. I'm like, this cannot be happening, man. I like, especially when you need to be mulliganing for your ramp for Yisan. I don't also want to have to be mulliganing all the time because I'm not hitting my colors, right? I'm just going to be starting the game with 4 cards in hand every time if that's the case.
Yeah, this is actually. I mean, well, I'm fully down to expand this into just the larger discussion about the just sort of like narrow cards in general, but specifically a pet peeve of mine for a long time at this point is that CDH players really don't care about their mana nearly as much as they should. There are far too many like 4-color decks out there right now. They're on like, yeah, I'll play Ancient Tomb and Emergent Zone and a Gemstone Caverns and maybe something else, and it's just like, that is you get to have one of those and it's probably going to be the Ancient Tomb.
So I think part of the issue here is that a lot of people are approaching mana in this format from the perspective of, I get 1 free mulligan, I can use that to smooth out my mana base problems, instead of approaching it from like the perspective of, I get 1 free mulligan to find a hand that's more degenerate if my first hand isn't degenerate enough.
Yeah.
And if you are pitching your hand 1 because of mana, like, you are potentially just like throwing away a hand that otherwise could have been degenerate if it had the correct colors.
Well, and there's also there's also something to be said as well for just maybe not even mindset, but there's some inherent biases in terms of playing CDH a lot of the time. I found where there's just in general more variance that can lead to you either being mana screwed or just like not having the colors on time, and like sometimes you just have to accept that even with a good mana base, you're not going to have the colors that you need. Obviously, this isn't necessarily the case in monocolor or even 2-color a lot of the time, but for the higher color decks, that's just sort of the case. And I feel like people tend to subconsciously write off like, oh, this hand's uncapable, but it's not the mana base's fault. It's just the variance of the format that's at fault here. Where I think a lot of the time that's not necessarily the case, and it's definitely either a mix of the two or even primarily the building of the mana base, or even just situational cards overall in the first place, that people are just sort of like just write off bad hands or bad experiences with cards as just inherent variance and just sort of move past that without thinking any deeper about it.
Yeah, well, one thing too, kind of along the lines that Phil was saying, of people using their mulligans kind of or they're using that as a bit of a crutch to fix kind of consistency issues in the mana base, or even stuff like ramp. Because I was doing a analysis. I actually did this like a couple months ago about how many, if you want to have 2 lands in your opener plus 1 card of some card type, like what would be how often, based off the different numbers, how often are you going to have to mulligan? And so I did this in terms of expected hand size, right? You need a lot of lands and a lot of, let's say we're going to use ramp as an example, right? You need a lot of lands and a lot of ramp if you want to be consistently opening those and not having to mulligan too deep for them. So like, to me, I think it definitely, there's different approaches to, mulliganing and deck construction in this respect. But personally, I much prefer to load up on lands and ramp so that I'm consistently hitting those cards in my hand, and then I can mulligan for the more broken pieces, right? Like then you can mulligan for your tutors or heuristic studies and remoras and the more broken pieces, because you've got the enough lands and ramp in your deck that you don't need to mulligan just to make your deck function. Then you can actually mulligan for as Phil was saying, like degenerate hands.
Which is just sort of the core of the format, let's be honest.
Run more lands, guys.
Yeah, so the Marwyn deck that I was playing, for example, has 27 lands, 28 if you count the Turn Timber Symbiosis as a full land.
Sure.
And like that feels very, very light to me.
Mm.
Yeah, I think personally, so at least in Marwyn, when your commander is a dork, I can get that a bit more. But I'll be honest, like there's very few decks I go below 30 lands in, unless it's like, I went below 30 lands in Cody. Like those are but I see people putting like going down to like
Cody
27 lands.
Yeah,
Cody can. Yeah, Cody certainly can. And it's like, but I just see people, in like a Thrasios Tymna deck that's maybe kind of trying to go a bit mid-range as well. There'll be like 28 lands, 27 lands, and Mox Diamond in there. I'm like, are you out of your mind? That's crazy to me.
I think for certain decks that support the full suite of elves and artifacts, I would go below 30. But that's basically it.
I don't even. You need if you want to open 2 lands in your hand and rocks, you need a lot of lands not just rock, but like ramp. You need a lot of lands and ramp. Like it's quite a bit.
This does just illustrate, though. This entire discussion does illustrate why dorks are so are much better than people like assume at face value in this format. Just because they increase the consistency of your ramp so much. Yes, they're not as fast as like artifact mana in a lot of ways. It's not as busted as like be able to like discount talismans or stuff, or like use talismans to like fix mana during storm turns or whatever. But the consistency of like being able to play that many dorks in your deck, like that many additional mana acceleration sources, is just huge in terms of the impact that it has on like being able to skimp on lands. I'm not saying you should be skipping a huge amount of lands, but just being able to like sort of reduce the number that you're playing just because you can consistently have a dork, just huge. Anyway, that's my dork shill for this episode.
Thank you.
I mean, one thing too, I think we were talking about EDH or CDH players, maybe getting a bit greedy on mana bases and stuff. But I'm sure this is probably something you can attest to, Phil. I think this is something kind of true broadly in Magic, where players tend to be not the best at making mana bases or figuring out the correct amount of lands to play. I think there's like a anecdote about when pros would take like top 5 or take like 5-0 deck lists to test them for like tournaments and stuff. The first thing they do is cut what they think is the worst spell and put in a land.
I will tell you that, like, as someone who does donation deck lists for my channel, so I almost never just play a deck list that I want to play. I'm always playing deck lists made by other people. Pretty much always the first thing I do is look at the mana base, like, see, are there enough lands? Do the lands produce the correct colors? And at least a third of the time, I am either adding lands or removing utility lands to actually make the mana bases work. I think conceptually when people brew, they get really excited about like the cards and the combos and the interactions, and the mana base is pushed to the side. And like it's the last thing that's done, when in reality, like a good mana base is often what makes a deck successful, right? In CEDH, like literally not having the correct mana pip can just like cost you an entire turn cycle, right?
Yeah.
Like I can't combo off because I don't have the extra blue mana here. And like if you don't pay attention to your mana base, that sort of thing is going to happen more frequently, especially in these like 4-color like greed piles of various natures.
Yeah. So I guess we've got a couple like sub points on here on the similarities and differences between CDH and Legacy. How have you viewed in your experience, kind of talking with CDH players, and how they look at cards. I guess have you you haven't been doing too much kind of CDH stuff since like a new set has come out, right? Like you haven't seen CDH players kind of look at spoilers, have you?
No, not really.
Okay, so I guess you're it might be kind of a bit different here, but I guess you can kind of get some implicit understanding of how CDH players evaluate cards based off of like deck composition. But is there is there some things that you think that Legacy players are valuing, really high, that CDH players are just like, that you'd think, oh wow, this is like just makes so much sense, and then a CDH player will be like, nah, this ain't it. I'm not putting this in my deck list. Anything like that you've noticed?
So I think the thing that was least obvious to me, and this is kind of taking it in a different direction, but I think this is still useful. The thing that was least obvious to me is how many times situational things can trigger in a 4-player format. Archivist of Ogma was one that really took me by surprise. Like, that was a card that is like probably not legacy playable. Like it's like maybe close. Like, I'm going to try it out for a legacy video once that card actually becomes available on Magic Online. Wizards,
looking forward
Wizards,
to it.
help with the card availability issues, please. But like when I saw that card like in play, just triggering so many times in a turn cycle, or the 4 mana Teferi that can be activated in every turn cycle. There's some of those things that trigger like once per turn that went from absolutely unplayable to like situational format all-stars. And I think it's really easy to dismiss the cards based on your evaluation of them in a 60-card 2-player context.
Yeah, I think that's actually probably like the primary difference in card evaluation between 60 card in general and 4-player or just multiplayer at all, especially free for all formats, where the value engines and the 1-for-1ing is just so much different in terms of what you're actually looking for, where it's a lot less valuable to have a card that like just goes like 2-for-1 on its own in the format, and it's so much more valuable to like have something that like have value engines, or just have engines period that scale up with the number of game actions being taken, or the number of opponents, or just the number of things that your opponents are putting down. And this spreads out over like so many different things, right? Like as you're saying, Archivist of Ogma, Teferi Teferi, what?
Master of Time.
As Master of Time. And then obviously like Rhystic Study, huge when you have like 2 additional opponents that are going to be casting stuff into it. Same thing with Mr. Kimura. But it even goes so far as to it changes evaluation on stuff like Pyroclasms as well, right? Like you have like one opponent playing at like 2 dorks. Yeah, it's a 2-for-1, but like, yeah, are the things that you're clearing actually that useful? Versus in like a 3-player format or a 4-player format where like, okay, all my opponents played like a dork or a Ragavan or an Esper Sentinel or just like some random X2, and then like somebody played an extra one. This is now like and 1-for-4 against the entire table, and you just clean up so much more, right?
And the thing is too, with something like a Pyroclasm, is you have 3 opponents, right? Like, so something, I guess it depends on what cards you're talking about in 60 card in particular, but a lot of times, if you're trying to do something more specific, right, to target like a specific deck or strategy, you're going to put that in the sideboard, and then you're going to bring that in games 2 and 3 in your match. Whereas in CDH, all pods are kind of self-contained, right? There's no sideboarding, so people will run, what could kind of be viewed as like more silver bullet kind of cards, because odds are when you're versing 3 opponents, it's going to be hitting at least one of those players, right? So the Pyroclasm, let's say you're against, a Grixis Storm deck, Rog Silas or something, sure, might not be that great, but the odds of there being some other player in the pod that's on green with dorks and stuff, or Timna, like, yeah, the Pyroclasm will help you clean up there, so you can still kind of evaluate that as being worthwhile include overall.
Yeah. One thing that, okay, in a competitive like 60 card format, like you're often playing like 7-ish round tournaments, right? and you might get a bad pairing in one of those rounds, and like if that happens, it sucks, but like you can recover from that. And there's this weird thing where in a pod there can be one person whose commander just instantly counters your deck and you just like can't do anything against that player, and it's like close to an auto lose situation. So for example, when I was playing Marwyn and someone just had like Jessica in the command zone, I was just like,
Yeah.
what is this shit? Like how am I ever supposed to win? And then I imagine like someone playing a storm deck might feel similarly, like when I sit down with this like Heliod Ballista deck that just has like 30 hate bears in it. Like there are going to be some very, very tough pairings for individual decks, and I haven't really figured out how to deal with that yet.
So I think a lot of times in CDH, not just silver bullets to kind of hate out your opponents, but often people try and build in a bit of a toolboxy way, right? So that it's like, at least I'm going to have an out to most scenarios. And that can be difficult depending on colors, right? Like if you're in red, let's say Magda or something, right? Stony Silence or, so like enchantment-based hate can be very rough, right?
If you're playing like Crick
chaos,
versus Roll of Flaws or something.
Yeah, you need like chaos warps and feed the swarms. But like people will run these less than efficient pieces of interaction just because of their versatility and ability to out niche pieces of stacks, because there are plenty of opportunities to run into those sorts of things. So
yeah. There's also I think a lot of the time as well, it's just there might not be like a hard answer for like how do I beat the counter matchup in a given pod of like. I think a lot of the time if you're playing certain decks, especially commander centric decks, run into this a lot. You just sort of have to accept the bad matchup a lot of the time, which means that really a majority of the time for tournament play, the actual answer is you just have to pick your deck based on what commanders you think you're going to see and what you're likely to see, and just try to dodge that stuff. Or realistically, the answer that a lot of people go with, which I mean sort of sucks for the current health of the format, is you just play a 4-color, 5-color value pile and just sort of by default have game against most stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of the impression I was getting as well.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to be quite that cynical, being so.
Oh no, we're fully doomer on this podcast. We have the episode on the.
I don't think it's quite that. I don't think it's quite that bad. I think there is a solid. I think there is a solid enough metagame where you can bring a deck which does kind of identify a slice that is not being hated on, and bring that deck and have just a higher chance of winning.
One thing certainly. I'll also say too is that like there is something to be said about deck choice and the availability of options. If you're in 4-color pile, like just card quality pile, you have things like Beseiju for artifacts, enchantments, Otawara if you want for kind of just miscellaneous anything. And then like trophies, Psych Rift, Decay. Like you've got lots of kind of generic answers, which is great. But even decks that are lower color and don't have those options, like I was talking about with Magda, will run these pieces to try and give them outs to as many things as possible. So you can kind of incorporate that kind of mentality into lower color decks and not just play 4-color piles. And this kind of can segue to something I want to talk about which is deck selection between differences and similarities between legacy players and CDH players. Because this is I'll share this this kind of secondhand quote, and hopefully I'm remembering this correctly. So I was listening to The Miscast, which is another CDH podcast hosted by Mikey and Drake Sasser, who's he's been playing CDH for a while, but he is I guess primarily identified as a 60 card. No, he from the podcast he was saying longer, quite a bit.
Oh,
longer.
really? Oh, wow.
Yeah,
like,
he
like
was absolutely a legacy grinder. As well. Like I absolutely recognize his name from the competitive scene. Like I know him.
Oh yeah, fully.
Yeah. So he was saying, and this I'm kind of interested to hear someone who's entrenched in legacy and kind of versus the CDH player's mindset, which is that when you're going to a tournament, this is something that he said it took him a while to learn as a 60 card player, but that you should just always be taking the best deck. And don't try and be like too cute with like counter picking to that. And sometimes it can be like the best deck for you, because you don't want to just sign up for a tournament and then like 2 days before you're like go on Goldfish. Okay, Delver looks like the best deck, and just jam Delver into the Legacy tournament. If you've never played a game of Delver before in your life, like that might not go well for you exactly. But I think the kind of spirit of it is like
not.
Is like if you've got a month out or whatever, or like you should be kind of familiar with what you think the best deck in the format is, and you're going to be doing better if you are become proficient with that deck and then take it to tournaments, which is something that, and he was saying that I think that CDH players should kind of adopt a similar mentality, and that's the kind of mentality he's adopting in CDH. But I don't think that piece of advice necessarily translates over, and we can kind of look at tournament results in CDH for the past couple of years, where it's not always the 4-color pile or whatever that's doing the best. I mean, we had the episode with Koibito, the winner of Marchesa, who was playing Magda, right? And sometimes in CDH, because of the 4-player free-for-all aspect, you can't win a 1v3, right? Whenever you could do that in a context with like lower power decks, right? With pre-cons, like I'll take my CDH deck 1v3 anytime. But when other decks are prepared, and they're powerful CDH decks as well, 1v3 can almost be insurmountable. So the power of, in the episode title, I think it was like the power of the unexpected. But taking decks where you're going to be either threat assessed accurately, so same as everyone else, or maybe even being underestimated and not getting the full amount of respect that your deck should be given, is actually a serious advantage that I don't think should be discounted at all.
In Legacy, we tend to refer to this as either the Brewer's advantage or the Rogue advantage. The issue is that a lot of times, like, you might be playing this thing that your opponent doesn't know how to optimally play against, and like you steal some wins because of that. But on the other side of the equation, like, doing this often means that you are playing cards that are kind of objectively worse than your opponent's cards. So if your opponent is a good enough player, or they have enough information that they can kind of figure out what's going on, you don't actually have that advantage versus the higher echelon of players. You have that advantage versus the lower echelon of players, who you might just beat anyway by just playing the best deck.
So I mean, Reed, we all took tier 1 con last year, or not we all. I mean, Matt took Cats, and then Morgan Reed took the same list of Cody, and then I took a variant list of Cody. And we took that because, one, we thought that Cody was the best deck, but we also felt that people, one, weren't going to completely understand it, and wouldn't give it the proper amount of respect it deserves. So I think, Reed obviously won the tournament, so there's some kind of lending credence to our kind of thinking there. But I mean, since then, I don't know how many tournaments have you thought where you're like, I want to take Cody, even though it hasn't necessarily decreased in power level, it still has all of its strengths. And I think the answer, I certainly wouldn't be taking Cody to tournaments too soon still, because people know what that deck is about, and they will 1v3 you, that just seems how
unfortunately
do you get out from that?
The meta is sort of, at this point, in my opinion, I don't want to bring us too far off track from interview and actually on topic discussions, but I think in terms of tournament meta right now, the idea is really to be just you play a deck that people like subconsciously don't respect, but still has a very strong strategy.
Yes.
Still has, not even strong strategy, but just a consistent access to its main game plan. And you just have to make sure that the main game plan is strong enough. Obviously, Magda has very hyper consistent access to its main game plan, right? Your commander is the tutor for the thing. You just need time.
and it plays at instant
some
speed, and it
dwarfs,
plays
right?
stacks. Like, it's not like it's doing things that aren't powerful. Like,
Yeah,
it
so
can be quite powerful. So
the idea is just to be, if you're playing, like, you're either playing a deck that people don't really, or that you think that people won't really have full respect for, but will still be able to do his thing consistently. And typically that means doing it consistently early. This was the Cody thing. Just Cody attempts to just jam turn 2s and turn 3. I don't know how much you've looked at the format, Phil. Cody is just 5-color, like, turbo ad nos pile that just tries to end the game on turn 2 or turn 3 with protection consistently. So, like, the idea is, like, when people aren't expecting it, you just try to end the game as fast as possible before people sort of know what's going on. But
and then even if
you're
some people
playing
are
a
respecting
good
it,
deck-
like, you have a lot of interaction. Like, everyone needs to be giving it a proper amount of respect.
That's for Cody specifically, but just for other
Yeah.
decks. Like, if you're, like, you sort of want to have access to early wins. But aside from that, if you're wanting to play the best deck in the format, I think, unfortunately, the answer right now is just that you need to be playing the best deck in the format with a plan for the late game, and to be able to just grind with the rest of the table and sneak in a win, or outgrind the rest of the table without seeming too threatening. Just because there's a very real chance that if you play a known quantity and try to jam early, people are just going to be super prepared for it, which is why, like, yeah, stuff like Rog Silas is sort of rough right now, Cody's sort of rough right now, Rog Timna also sort of rough right now, and then even stuff like
Blue
Winota.
Farm,
Obviously, Winota has issues otherwise, but that's also one of the main reasons I think why we're not seeing a whole lot of Winota right now, is just because it's you have, like, this deck that's very obvious what it's about to do, and it tries to jam, like, stuff relatively early. I mean, Winota gets on the ground very quickly, compared to a lot of other stack stacks. But the issue is that just, like, it's so easy to focus down, and you just, like, can't beat a couple of cards. Like, you can't beat a Containment Priest, can't really beat Grafdigger's Cage. Double room removal on Winota is basically game over. Yeah, you have to be in one of the two areas if you're actually trying to, like, spike a tournament, basically. It's one of the two categories. Anyway, sorry, that was far too long-winded for what the actual point at the end was, but back to deck selection. I do actually want to ask.
Go ahead.
I do actually want to ask Phil specifically, just in the context of, do you think that like, the lack of sideboards actually affects the process of deck selection that much? Like, obviously the lack of sideboards affects, like, how you build decks, etc. Do you think it affects, like, deck selection at all?
I think it incentivizes you to have a game 1 plan that is either inherently extremely powerful or extremely flexible, right? Like, using the Marwyn example from a minute ago, like, if you're playing Marwyn or some other, like, pseudo tribal deck list, and your opponent sits down with Jeska, like, oh no, you don't get to fix that via sideboarding, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, I think, while, like, maybe it might not be objectively on a lot of people's minds, I think after playing games with commanders or strategies that have, like, very glaring, I would normally call it game 1 weaknesses, but they're just game weaknesses now.
I think, like, you could probably be pretty easily described as just probably commander reliance or over commander reliance a lot of the time.
Yeah, and I think that's why a lot of CEDH decks just have these inherently powerful, like, ad nauseum or Thassa's Oracle based win conditions, or maybe your commander plus one other card win conditions. It's because, like, yeah, you might not have time to find your answer all of the time, or you might not have the deck building space or the flexibility for all of these answers. So, like, I think it's a factor, but I don't think most people sit down, like, start building their CEDH deck and go, like, oh man, I can't sideboard, so I need to have everything in game 1. I think it's more about having a decent number of win conditions or flexible answers.
Right.
One thing I also want to talk about with deck selection is, so I've kind of got, people talking about, like, selecting the best deck or whatever. I think fundamentally, CEDH players are EDH players, and EDH players like to play the decks they enjoy, not necessarily what's always the best, right? And and like I said, there's arguments that the brewer's advantage, as Phil put it, or the balancing or trying to fly under the radar, be have your opponents not respect your deck a lot. Those can be advantages, but even still, I think people just don't always vibe with playing the best deck, or even if they can identify what they think the best deck is, they play strategies that they enjoy. Would you say it's similar in? I mean, certainly in Legacy. That would you say? Would you agree that Delver is the best deck in Legacy?
Yes. And if everyone was playing the best deck, or the deck that they thought would be beat the best deck, we would have 50% Delver instead of 22% Delver, right? There is, I think, this internal itch for people to try to break the format, to try to build the thing that beats the best thing instead of just playing the best thing. And I am someone who has usually played the deck that beats the best deck instead of playing the best deck. So I'm guilty of this because Death and Taxes is usually a deck that beats Delver. It is just full of things that are super annoying for Delver. You tend to have a very good Delver matchup, but that comes at the cost of being relatively bad versus other powerful strategies like, say, Elves or Doomsday.
So I mean, I guess there's I think maybe it's less not just an EDH player thing, but probably just a Magic and human thing to not want to always just do what's the best, but to do something you enjoy the most. But based off the fact that Delver's at 20% of the meta, I'd guess that there's just a bit more of a proclivity to choose the best deck in something like Legacy or just 60 card constructed.
Another big difference between Legacy and CEDH here is the CEDH community is 100% pro proxy all the time, whereas the Legacy community is kind of split on it because many of the tournaments are officially sanctioned events where proxies are not allowed. And so switching decks on a dime is not nearly as easy in Legacy. To play CEDH, I bought a nice printer and I printed decks. I bought some Dragon Shields, and that was that.
I'm so happy to hear that.
Yeah, I am full pro proxy, abolish the reserve list, absolutely a crusader. You have my sword.
Hold on.
Yeah, wait.
Those are two different arguments.
I'm fully behind him. Let's get it on.
Of course you are.
Okay, so actually, we were going to save this for the last question, but I think since you brought up proxies, I think this is kind of just a good natural segue. So our kind of last question was about Legacy itself, and not necessarily kind of comparing to CDH necessarily directly, but it's as kind of all of us, myself, Matt, Reed, and Morgan, we've joined the CDH community not right at the beginning, but we were in there when it wasn't
pretty
too
early
big.
adopters.
Yeah, pretty early adopters, and we've got to see it grow into I never would have imagined that we'd have a community this big, where deck specific Discord servers have 3,000 members, and CDH specific content is as big as Playing with Power. They're massive for just CDH specific content. So it's crazy to have seen the kind of growth of this format, and at the same time, so I guess when I first joined Magic, and I looked at Legacy ooh, this is so cool. This is what the big boys are playing. This is real high level Magic. But it seems that I think especially with the pandemic and kind of listening to some different Legacy podcasts, it seems that Legacy, the player base of Legacy seems to be a bit on the decline. And I wanted to kind of get you to speak on that a bit, maybe what's it been like seeing the growth of CDH kind of come out of nowhere? Is Legacy declining a bit? How do we get bring back interest in Legacy? Is it proxies? What are we doing here?
So the two things happened at the same time that it wasn't a death blow to Legacy, but it was real bad. So Legacy got hit with this huge period of stagnancy where this fire design happened in this like post War of the Spark world where like Uro, Oko, Astrolabe, Mush took over the format. It was incredibly boring to play against for the most part, and it invalidated a huge number of decks. And I don't use that word lightly, but like almost overnight, hundreds, thousands of people Legacy decks just became obsolete and not tournament viable because of how powerful those cards were in conjunction. And that, coupled with no bans, coupled with the pandemic hitting and making it so that like paper events weren't happening, like those two things hitting at the same time caused so many people to sell out of their Legacy collection, either because they were frustrated with the format, they hit financial hardships due to the pandemic, they just like didn't like the fire design, and like Legacy didn't feel like it used to. That was really hard on the format, and things are better than they used to be, but now we're in this like period of blue-red Delver dominance again. And there's a lot of just like malaise hanging around Legacy, and people aren't super excited about it for the most part.
I guess I'll just throw this out. Is CDH bigger / more popular than Legacy right now, do you think? Or is it approaching?
It's really hard for me to judge that. Like, I'm new enough to the CEDH community that like I don't feel like I can give you an authoritative answer here. Here's what I'll say. I feel like Legacy is maintaining steam. I don't think it's like losing ground or not losing ground quickly. Okay. It's just kind of chilling. Whereas CEDH is like revving its engines and getting ready to just like blast off into space. Like the paper magic is coming back. People are organizing these CEDH events. It's starting to get the interest of like these tournament grinders, these pros. It's starting to pick up more coverage. CEDH is probably going somewhere. Like, I think this is a format that if the logistics of tournaments ends up being like viable and okay, and you end up with your version of the MTR and other Magic rules documents that makes running tournaments like acceptable and smooth, like that format probably has a real future, especially if like the air quotes sanctioned events are as proxy friendly as the community as a whole is.
Because I definitely feel there's a weird kind of like Legacy, and you can clarify me on this because I am by no means an expert on the format history, but my understanding is that it is also very much a community format, right? A community driven format, unlike something like Standard or maybe even Modern at this point, where it's WotC can it's more WotC driven. So I've always kind of viewed CDH, Legacy, as almost like the big brother of CDH in a lot of respects. Like, the Legacy community kind of did it first, and then the CDH community has kind of been, cribbing a lot of the notes from Legacy. And we picked up a lot of different habits. I mean, we picked up different strategies from Legacy decks. We picked up the terrible naming convention of Legacy decks.
I apologize. CEDH players, stop now. Your format is young enough where you can save yourself from this shit. Every day I record a video, and you know what the first thing I have to do is explain my deck name. I have to tell you why my deck is Nick Fit or Cheerios or Ice Station Zebra. And let me tell you,
Beathooks is a great
after
name.
a while, like, people forget why these names existed, and there become false versions of why the name is the way it is. Save yourself now.
I think we're too deep in at this point.
Farm is like the worst thing that happened to CDH. Man.
Yeah, farm
it's like they named it. The name came because of like Bruce Tarl being like a farmer, some like internal headcanon of like Bruce Tarl having a farm with Timna or something like that, right? and then it's exploded. No one even knows what it really means.
Farm
anymore.
basically
People
just
say
means
it
deck
to sound
now.
cool. But yeah, so I think we took a lot of, as a CDH community, we took a lot of lessons from Legacy. And obviously we did a couple things different, but I'd be interested to kind of see, as CDH, like you're saying, is kind of revving up and Legacy is in a kind of bit of a holding pattern. Is there anything for that Legacy can learn from CDH, what the CDH community has done to kind of rev up interest in Legacy? Because honestly, I think there's a lot of there is a bit of a Legacy to CDH pipeline from, I've talked to many players who are like, oh, I used to play Legacy and I want to play Commander, and CDH kind of seemed right up my alley. And there is similarities in card pool, the competitive mindset, play patterns, there's card overlap. So there does seem to be like CDH players maybe would be the kind of people who'd enjoy Legacy. So how do we maybe get more cross-pollination going on between our two formats?
Collaborative content is kind of the easiest way to cross the streams successfully, right? Like, I have been invited on a handful of both EDH and CEDH streams in the last couple of weeks that has absolutely welcomed me into the format, kindled my interest for the format, made me wanting to make resources for the format. Reaching out to people and actively trying to incorporate them into your community is the way that you grow your community. A lot of people who play Legacy are the same people who have been playing Legacy forever, and their collections are massive. And how do they get people into the community? For them, it's often like lending decks so new people can try out the format and see if they like it. On the CEDH side, where everything is proxied, it's not lending the decks, it's lending your time, it's lending your platform. Reach out to these people who you might be interested. Say, hey, we have an open spot for this pod on X day. Do you want to put together a deck and try this out with us? I think the excitement and the energy that people have for CEDH can be contagious if you actively branch out and reach out to new people.
I think what you're saying with CDH players welcoming kind of Legacy players in, trying to get you guys interested in our format. Yeah, maybe we need to do a bit of the opposite direction as well. Maybe put on like a Legacy CDH player invitational or something like that, right? Where we're getting a bunch of like people who've never really done stuff in Legacy before, who are used to CDH, and kind of drum up some interest that way. There's all kinds of different things that that we could go on, but I love listening to Legacy content and watching Legacy content, and maybe I'm part of the problem because I haven't made the jump to actually playing too much Legacy, but I definitely want to see that community prosper as well.
I'll give a example of this. Rebel reached out to me today saying, hey, how would you feel about swapping an hour of each other's time? Like, I'll ask you questions about competitive play and 60 card formats, and you ask me questions about CEDH stuff. And like, we haven't set a time to do that yet, but like, that's something we're going to do, and that is going to help both of us immensely. Because let me tell you, like, I've been playing CEDH for a couple of weeks now. I've probably played about 24 games. I don't know what you mean when you say the farm, right? Like,
Yes.
I don't know what you mean when you use like all these colloquialisms unique to your format. Like, I definitely have things to learn from someone who has the time to talk to me about them.
Okay, let's just be clear about farm. No one knows what farm means.
It means whatever it means whatever the context demands.
This is Stacks farm. This is mid-range farm. This is...
It's well, it was like the Michael Scott quote from The Office of like he's explaining like I think it's like the pilot like que sera sera. He's like, it's just kind of like a non sequitur. You just say it. That's what farm is, man. You just say it, and it's whatever. Cool. So got a couple more questions here before we move into the gut check. So I'll let Reed and Matt get these ones.
Yeah, definitely. I think I'll probably just ask a pretty simple one. Are there any like single cards that you would love to like sort of port into or like stick into CDH decks and play with that like you haven't really seen people playing with from Legacy or like other formats at all?
I don't think I have seen enough of the deck pool to accurately answer that question, because I'm sure I could say a card here and then someone would be like, well, no, that's in the Sticky Fingers deck, actually.
I mean, it might
Oh,
be strictly for
we'll fend
entertainment
them off
value.
for you. Is there any are there any like specific ones just from your like current experience with the format that you haven't seen that you want to?
No, I can't think of anything off the top of my head here. There have been a couple of times where I'm like, why isn't this in this deck list? And then I started thinking about like number of slots you're dedicating to things, and it's like, oh, that's probably why.
Okay.
Yeah, fair enough. Matt?
Yeah, and I guess to that similar vein, if you could port over, a particular legacy deck or strategy that you haven't seen in CEDH, you were playing Mono White Heliod today, but what would it be?
So I've talked a little bit about this with other people. The issue with a lot of legacy decks is they are built to kill one person. One of the most iconic legacy combo decks is Painter Servant plus Grindstone, which is an infinite mill combo. Or by similar logic, you have Leyline of the Void plus Helm of Obedience. Well, guess what? Those only kill one person at a time, and in a 4-player combat scenario, like all of a sudden that's not viable anymore. And similarly, there's plenty of other strategies, say like a burn deck, a Boggles style deck list where you're trying to like suit up one thing, that become a lot less attractive in multiplayer combats. So while in theory it sounds really cool to try to like port legacy ideas into CEDH, or maybe port CEDH decks into legacy, the differences between formats often mean that you can't do that for everything. Sometimes it'll work. You can take a Death and Taxes style deck list and port that into CEDH. You can take an Elves style deck list and port that into CEDH, but it doesn't work all of the time. I actually think you would have more success porting CEDH combos into Legacy, because the cards that you are playing are still objectively very powerful. They just are maybe a little slower than normal. So for example, you can take the Birthing Pod chain that's available in the... What's the mono red commander that has like a 5-color activated ability?
Mono red?
Mono.
With 5 color?
You mean
Yeah, it's like a red commander. It's got...
Najeela.
Najeela, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so like I've played a decent number of games versus Najeela Pod. That whole pod chain that deck uses to combo off is like... That is available in Legacy. And if you can activate your Birthing Pod and it always wins you the game, that is a viable fringe strategy that like you can probably play in a league and get a 3-2 with, right? Like that is the sort of thing that I could make a video with and it would be entertaining. I think you can create low power level legacy decks that can do okay from CEDH decks, and like you can do that for funsies, and then maybe every once in a while you will actually create something that's good. But just as a reminder, most brews fail, and that's okay.
Yep.
Yeah. I do
100%.
think, CDH players have a bit of an obsession with Legacy. It's Legacy. It's not vintage. It's not modern. It's specifically with Legacy and porting over, like, maybe not porting over directly, but making decks that are kind of like similar or analogous to Legacy decks. So an example would be with Delver, right? It's like, how the hell would you port over Delver to CDH? Well, what people will sometimes refer to as their Delver deck or Delver style deck is like Jeska Ishai, where the idea is that you're going to slam Ishai, which whenever an opponent casts a spell, it puts a +1/+1 counter on it. And you're just going to try and play, and that's flying, and you're just going to try and play hard, like control people, don't let them win the game, and then you're just going to chip in at their life totals with this giant flying commander
that gets triple strike from Jessica sometimes.
Yeah, and then there's like elf ball style decks for elves. There's like doomsday decks, thoracle
Oh,
decks.
I mean, all the
like, there's
classic,
so
the
many
classic
decks get ported
CDH
over.
combos basically are all directly derived from either current, like, legacy decks or old legacy decks, where it's like, yeah, Hermit Druid, basically the entire strategy is based off of, like, old Hermit Druid decks from Extended, and, like, yeah, Food Chain, basically an exact rip of Legacy Food Chain, for the most part, from that strategy, or, like, Doomsday, or just, like, any of these other combos.
Maybe the one that I think is, like, paint. I think there are some decks that run Painter Grindstone, but they're like, there's not many.
A lot of them actually use it
old
to mill
decks, though.
themselves instead of milling opponents, because you can actually target yourself with the grindstones. So you can see stuff like Duretti and Mono Red will actually sometimes play Painter Grindstones so they can mill themselves out and then weld with Duretti to get something back from the bin.
I feel like the least, maybe one that's has some viability that just isn't been poured over at all. I mean, it's hard to definitely find space for it, certainly, but like a Lurin combo or something like that.
Yeah,
There's one
Allurin is
that-
sort of like it's like the holy grail combo piece for CDH, because like nobody has actually really been able to make it work as a standalone. Obviously Hullen can play it. Just like Bant.
Yeah.
Like Bant Allurin with the outlet in the command zone, as long as you have a self bounce creature. But like I don't think anybody has ever successfully put together a 4 or 5 color Allurin deck.
So
It's
I
like
think I can
it's-
explain why that is. I have a lot of
Yeah,
experience.
please
with
do.
This deck.
Yeah. Please explain to our viewers why you should never play Allurin in CDH, because we've been trying to get, or I've been trying to get this point across at least for like 4 years at this point to people.
Okay, let's use a more simplistic example here. Let's use show and tell, where you and your opponent both get to put a thing into play, right? You put in your big bad Emrakul, and most of the time, your opponent is going to put in something less cool than Emrakul, and accordingly, you get to win the game.
By rule of cool, of course. You
Yes.
just put in the cooler thing.
Put in the cooler thing to win the game. However, when you move this to a multiplayer format and you cast your show and tell like card, now it's not you versus one person. Now it's you versus 3 other people. And with Allurin specifically, like, can you imagine the number of cards that your opponents can cast for free if they have like a close to full drip?
I don't have to imagine. I've witnessed it.
Yeah.
Like, there's so many like opposition agent style
Yep.
cards in the format, especially if
Yep.
someone is playing like a mono white deck. Like, trying to combo off with an Allurin like often works in Legacy because it's a 2-card combo, and you're expecting that your opponent isn't going to have very many interactive creatures. But a lot of lower curve interactive creatures are played in this format, even in decks that aren't necessarily all about hate bears, right? Because like
Yep.
powerful cards like Containment Priest can kind of like screw over one or sometimes multiple of your opponents.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of
There's
sense.
there's also the secondary issue with Allurin and CDH as well, which is the fact that it's sort of like a density based combo deck in terms of like you have your 4 Allurins, but a lot of the time in 60 card Allurin, the rest of the deck is all sort of stuff that either like digs toward additional combo pieces or is like sort of protection or is just like value. Like you're playing like probably a playset of I haven't looked in the Allurin list recently. Don't yell at me, Legacy players. I'm assuming you're on like a playset of like Icefang Coatls, a playset of like Baleful Strixes, you're on some Recruiters, like you're on a lot of stuff that like finds other stuff or like keeps the gas going. CDH you get like 1 Baleful Strix, 1 Icefang Coatl, 2 Recruiters, and then you have to fill the other 94 cards of your deck out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, decks that are trying to force a card are typically pairing that up with some commander synergy, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So once we get our commander that somehow works with Lurin, I'm happy.
Well, I mean, which we do have. Like, let's be clear, Holland does do a lot of stuff with that card, but it isn't Bant, unfortunately enough.
It doesn't fix the problem.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that's a good point to wrap up our main interview and move on to everyone's favorite segment, Gut Check.
Gut check.
Okay, so we're going to be taking a slight detour from the normal way we approach Gut Check. What we've done is we thought it'd be interesting to compile a list of a couple cards that, you know, some that are highly played in CDH, some that are more played in Legacy, and do a bit of a card evaluation gauntlet with Phil here. So we're going to give a card, and we're going to get Phil to give us a rating out of 5, 5 being the highest, 1 the worst, or I guess 0 the worst, for CEDH, to the best of his understanding, and give us a brief explanation as to why he thinks it's either good, bad, or medium.
All right, this will be fun.
We'll read out the card with the card text as well, just in case you're not familiar.
Yeah, one crucial aspect you forgot to
some of these
are pretty.
Yeah.
One crucial aspect you're missing here is our audience will see this in poll form and will potentially grade your assignment and give you a final mark.
So what we're gonna do? Yeah, what we'll do is we'll post this to our Discord server. We've got a gut check channel. So normally we do it kind of like a poll style, but what I think we're gonna do is just give a thumbs up or thumbs down, so whether or not they think you've got a passing grade or a failing grade. So if you've got more thumbs up than thumbs down, then mission accomplished.
You did it.
Okay. I'll kick things off with a card that we've mentioned earlier in the episode, and that would be Ristic Study. So, just as a reminder, Ristic Study is a blue enchantment for 2 and a blue. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, you may draw a card unless that player pays 1 generic mana.
Card's pretty good. It is not a card that literally wins the game. It is not like an ad nauseum in that regard, but this represents an absolutely absurd amount of advantage. I'd probably rate this one at like a 4.5. Nice.
Yeah. And this is again, I'll throw back mention to Drake Sasser. I think he was saying on the miscast about how when he first came to EDH, he was like, Ristics, why is this card good? And I think that sometimes 60 card players have a bit of this, you could see why, right? You look at Ristic Study, you're like, well, I mean, it's a 3 mana asymmetrical sphere resistance until they don't want it to be anymore, right? It's always going to be whichever is the worst of those two for you. So sees basically no 60 card play. But sees play at every level of Commander, and in Commander it is an all-star. So yeah, kind of interesting on that one.
Yeah, you gave me a layup for the first one. Thank you.
Yeah.
yeah. That was an easy one. So borrowing cards from other formats a little bit here. Preordain. I feel like I don't have to read this one out, but for the audience, I guess I will. 1 blue sorcery, scry 2, then draw a card.
And we can also lump in like Ponder, Brainstorm, just kind of like those.
I think
the good legacy cantrips in general.
I think
you probably separate Brainstorm from those.
Yeah.
Sure.
Maybe Ponder, but
yeah, you could give all of those separate ratings if you want, but
I think it's
do want
best
to
to
hear
just keep it to the one.
Your take on cantrips.
Sure. They feel maybe more like 3s or 3.5s. Like they are absolutely playable, but you have access to a lot of tutors that are banned in Legacy, and I like when you can play a tutor to find your 2-card combo rather than digging for it with a cantrip. That feels preferable to me. Like cantrips absolutely feel playable to me, but I don't see a lot of people spending time casting normal cantrips, especially when they can just like outright draw cards, like via like Timna or Ristic Studies or stuff like that. So like, card's fine, like good power level card, like it's going to make it into decks, but I am a lot less excited about these. With the exception of Brainstorm. Brainstorm is still stupid.
So I think it was actually your co-host Brian Cook who I was listening to an episode where he was guesting on, and he was saying that he's moved off of cantrips in his ROG Silas deck, which is something that I've been very anti-cantrip in CDH for a while. I mean, not just generically. I mean, it depends on the deck, but unless there's like an obvious synergy, I tend not to be a fan of them. So it was interesting to see a player who obviously knows the strength of cantrips decide to move off of them in CEDH as well. So yeah, that was really interesting. I think it definitely has to do with the fact that the Xerox kind of philosophy in Legacy, and it can't be ported over directly to CDH in with a 100 card singleton.
Yeah, without turning this into a huge bit, the difference is in Legacy you get to play 4 Preordain, 4 Brainstorm, 4 Ponder. The redundancy is huge there. And if you're like pondering, looking at 3 cards of your, 90 cards remaining in your library, looking for one thing, like you are not getting nearly as far. So like I think
It does
this
have a much
makes
higher density of shuffle effects too.
Yeah. So like
in 60 card, yeah.
I think this makes it in some decks, but this isn't winning me games.
Okay.
Great.
Wade, what do we got up next?
Next up, we got a. I would call this one a multi-format all-star until it wasn't. So next up, we have Treasure Cruise. Again, for the audience, I don't know who doesn't know these cards.
It seems weird to talk about these cards.
So it costs 7 and a blue to cast. It's a sorcery, and it reads draw 3 cards.
It has Delve. It also has.
It does have Delve. Sorry, it has Delve.
It would not be good if it didn't have Delve.
It would not be good if it was 8 mana draw 3 at sorcery speed.
So this feels pretty close to unplayable to me. Let's call this like a 1.5. Like Treasure Cruise is an absurd card. This like absolutely got banned in Legacy, but I feel like a difference here is that in Legacy, like you can afford to like pay 3 mana for your Treasure Cruise when you need to do that. And that, like, doing something like that in CEDH, like, sounds so much more scary if you're a blue deck. You're not holding up your Flusterstorms or, whatever other piece of interaction you want to be holding up. And I think you run into 2 other problems here with Treasure Cruise. One is that people are randomly going to play graveyard hate cards like Rest in Peace, like, just because, like, graveyards are such an important resource because you have, like, Breach decks, Reanimator decks, and whatever. And the other is just, like, the time required to get set like 6 or 7 cards in graveyard to make this reasonable doesn't feel great. I would rather get my card advantage from other sources than something like a Treasure Cruise.
Cool.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I definitely, and I think probably another one. I think all those reasonings are totally valid. By the way, I think you pretty much hit the nail on the head there. I think another one as well for our listeners is that in 60 card formats where you're treasure cruising a lot of the time, you have a high density of effects that allow you to self-mill yourself, as well as having additional like effects that you want. Like you're fine playing a 4 of Thought Scour in a deck if you can play a Treasure Cruise in it. You're getting sort of replacement as well as fueling your Ancestral Recall for later. You just don't really have the same density of self-mill in CDH. It's just a lot harder. It takes a lot longer to get stuff into your bin a lot of the time, unless your commander is expressly like doing that kind of stuff, like self-milling or wants cards in your graveyard so you can justify playing those self-mill cards.
Cool. Next up, we were going through a couple legacy all-stars here. Next up, we've got Counterbalance, which is an enchantment for blue. Whenever an opponent plays a spell, you may reveal the top card of your library. If you do, counter that spell if it has the same converted mana cost as the revealed card.
So I did see one of these in play earlier today, to be fair. I am not necessarily overly impressed by Counterbalance in a 3-player format. You are going to have more chances to just like randomly spike things and counter things, but you don't run into as many situations where you can brainstorm successfully in order to put the correct thing on top with Counterbalance. I think if you have something in your deck, like a commander that synergizes with this, it seems okay. But I'm not excited to be running this card. I'd probably call it like a 2.
Okay. Yeah, so one thing, unlike in 60 card decks that run Counterbalance, and I mean it's seen play in it's most notorious for, or infamous, I guess, from Legacy with Miracles. Yeah. But it's also seen play in Modern with cards like Mishra's Bauble and Mystic Sanctuary. So they're very focused, especially with Brainstorm, Top, just manipulating the top card of your deck to basically, be able to counter anything. The way it's played in CDH, I mean, there are decks that run Counterbalance top, but top is not quite as good in CDH as it is in something like Legacy. And when decks are running Counterbalance, often they're relying on the ability to kind of reset the top of their library, or rely on kind of the blind flip factor. So when a lot of decks in CDH are extremely low mana curve, with probably 40% of spells being 1 or 2 drops. So when you have a Counterbalance in play, and your opponent let's say has a Thassa's Oracle and Demonic Consultation in hand, and there's a Counterbalance and it's not been flipped on something like a Mana Dork, right? Because you don't want to flip on something and reveal the top just to maybe get a snag a dork. You want to kind of maintain that mystery, and so it's really difficult to kind of just willingly jam your Thoracle Consult into a Counterbalance when there's a 40% chance they're going to be able to flip on one of your 2 combo pieces, and their counter spells in hand are not going to be able to do anything about it. So there's a bit, I think, of a different philosophy to Counterbalance in CDH, but the jury is I guess still out a bit on Counterbalance. It's not a widely accepted staple, I would say. Cool. Next up.
Sure. Next up, we've got Wheel of Fortune. So 2 and a red sorcery. Each player discards their hand and then draws 7 cards.
So wheels to me feel like 5s in certain decks and 0s in other decks. So
amen.
if you are the defense grid deck and you have put your shields off and you are storming off or comboing off or whatever, the Wheel of Fortune is great for you in that style of deck. But in absolutely no world do I want to be playing Fair Magic where I feed 7 new cards to a bunch of degenerates who have sat down for games of CEDH. I do not want to be playing Wheel of Fortune because I am a red deck. I want to be playing Wheel of Fortune because I feel like I am doing the most unfair stuff at the table, or I am doing this while having protection.
Kind of sounds
like
we're leading
the
towards the
0/5 score. I like that. I like that.
Yeah.
So we've got 2 more.
I like the full split there. Yeah. So for our next one, we got a bit of a weirder one. Got ourselves Strip Mine.
We thought about putting on Wasteland, and we're like, no, let's put on Strip Mine. Yeah.
put on the much cooler version. Well, depending on what side of the table you're on. So Strip Mine is just a land that taps for colorless and can also tap and sacrifice itself to destroy target land.
Maybe a 1.5. I love Strip Mines and Wastelands and Ghost Quarters and all the cards of this style.
We
but
know you
the
do.
reason those are usually viable is because they are going and supplementing a plan of choking your opponent on resources. And it is so hard to simultaneously choke 3 other players on resources while also advancing some other game that you have. I understand wanting to have the utility of some land destruction in your deck list, but this would be a time where I would be looking at mana bases and going do I need an out to your random Maze of Ith, or do I need an out, or sorry, do I just need more colored pips so I can cast my spells properly?
Yeah. I mean, I think you nailed it. The deck that probably used to be, I don't think any deck runs. I mean, I'm not gonna say that. There's probably decks that run Strip Mine.
Azusa does, but that's Azusa.
But so the deck that's probably best suited to run Strip Mine is Gitrog, because it runs Raminap, Excavator, and Life from the Loam, and is very much and it's also cantripping off of strip mining
Gets
people.
multiple strip lines
And
by default,
and additional land drops. So there is a deck that is like perfectly set up to abuse strip mine and does not run it. And was cut years ago, simply basically for the reasons you were saying. One, it's like your mana in 1v1. When you strip mine someone, it's a I guess I'll put it in brackets because I mean we could probably spend an entire episode evaluating strip mines and wasteland land destruction in 60 card. But yeah, it's a 1-for-1, right? You're spending one land to remove a land from your opponent. Maybe you got a bit more of an advantage because you get to select which land that is. But in 4-player free-for-all, obviously you've got 3 opponents, and trading that 1-for-1 land resource is also putting you down on mana as well. So yeah, people have moved off of that. Listen, I did play a brief stint in like a modified ban list format where a lot of the stuff was taken off the ban list, and I did put strip mine back into Get Rog when I was playing with Fast Blonde, because that's
that's
okay.
just
Sure, like in that world, absolutely. When you can strip mine every land in a turn cycle, go nuts, live your best life.
Awesome. And then our last one here is Steel Enchantment. Hold on, let me pull this up.
You can't screw up this one.
For context, Phil, this is the exact reason why we've been reading all these out.
So Steel Enchantment, blue enchantment. It's gain control of enchanted enchantment.
Okay. So you use this to steal a Rhystic Study or other similarly powerful thing. I don't know. I could understand playing this. Like, in some ways, it would be better than playing a removal spell, like a single target removal spell on something. But like, this is a sorcery speed answer to a single permanent, where if your answer to their answer is later answered, they get their thing back. I'm not really super excited about this. I get that there are higher than average level densities of powerful enchantments in this format, but I don't know. I'm not super gung-ho about this. I'll say like a 2.
Well, sorry guys, Phil has kicked off the show. This was a great episode.
you might only see Morgan, Lyndon, Reed, and I downvote this, and the rest of our audience upvote it.
Yeah.
I think too, you've actually been very generous for what is effectively a pet card for our local meta.
I don't even think it's that pet card for local meta, man. I'm a big stan of this card.
It's totally
no, okay. Our local meta, it's insane, but I do think there are some decks that where if you're a control deck and you can't beat Remoras and Rhystic Studies, that basically stick around forever in the mid or late game. Because you're trying to maintain your card advantage and kind of eke that out. Whereas if you're casting a spell like every time into someone's Remora, it can just be impossible to ever, really control that game. So Steel Enchantment, also I guess in mono blue, the best kind of removal you have for enchantments anyway is bounce, and that's like bounce plus counterspell is really, really mediocre. So the fact that you can remove one of these problematic permanents, either Remora, Rhystic Study, Carpet of Flowers, especially in mono blue, and then develop one for yourself is honestly huge. So I like it even outside of our meta, but I do think there's enough strong enchantments to work it. And honestly, I'm a bit hurt, but I'll accept it.
He'll live.
Yeah. Cool. So I think and I said to all of our listeners, we can you can vote on how let us know how Phil did. I think he did pretty good.
He did definitely.
I think these are pretty great, honestly.
Yeah.
I spend so much time evaluating bad cards contextually. I've gotten pretty good at it.
So yeah, I just wanted to give a big thanks for making the time to come on our show, and we wanted to give you an opportunity to plug yo shit. So yeah, go plug away. I know we plugged a bit at the beginning, but let us know what you're up to, where to find you, and whatnot.
Yeah, please give me a follow on Twitter at ThrabenU, THRABENU, and you can find me on YouTube under the same name. If you're gonna watch one video to see whether or not you like my content, I recommend checking out my Yokel Hops video. It's a banger, and it plays some very fun, very silly cards, and is a very entertaining league.
Awesome.
Well,
yeah, thanks again, Phil, for coming on. That about wraps it up for this episode. If you guys would like to reach out to us with any questions, comments, or concerns, you can contact us on Twitter at Into the North Pod, via our email, intothenorthpodcast@gmail.com, or on our Discord server, the invite link for which can be found in the description for this episode. An extra special thanks to all of our patrons who help cover the expenses for our show and allow us to work towards improving the quality of the podcast. If you too would like to become a patron, we are at patreon.com/IntoNorthPodcast. Another way you can support us is via our TCG Player affiliate link. So anytime you want to purchase something from TCG Player, you use our affiliate link, which is in the podcast/YouTube description. A portion of your purchase goes towards supporting the podcast. Thank you, as always, to the band Vox Cadre for our lovely podcast music, and to Nate Slupper for our equally lovely podcast logo. Next episode will be out in 2 weeks. Until then, see ya.
bye.
See ya.